She thought he was just another ordinary customer, until she realized he was the most powerful man in the room. And worse? He had been watching her the whole time. The morning sun spilled golden light across the grand lobby of Bashore Hotel, a luxurious resort perched on the edge of the California coastline. Outside, waves lapped rhythmically against the shore, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding inside. The hotel's Seabreeze bistro was packed. Silverware clattered against porcelain, coffee cups clinked, and a steady hum of conversation filled the air. The scent of freshly brewed espresso mixed with the warmth of buttered croissants and sizzling bacon. For Megan, a 24-year-old waitress, none of it felt the least bit charming. She was exhausted. Irritated. Running on fumes. Megan, table 5 needs extra syrup. She barely looked up as Liam, her co-worker, rushed past her, balancing a tray of omelets and toast. She scribbled furiously on her notepad, her ponytail swinging as she dodged a busboy carrying a stack of dirty plates. "Excuse me, miss," a voice called from behind her. She turned, plastering on a fake smile, only to see a businessman in a crisp navy suit tapping his empty coffee cup. "We've been waiting on a refill for 20 minutes, he said, irritation laced in his voice. Megan bit back a groan. "It's coming right up, sir." She spun toward the coffee station just as another customer snapped their fingers at her from across the room. "Miss, our check? And can I get a decaf instead?" someone else piped up. Megan inhaled sharply, forcing herself to stay composed. It had been like this all morning. Customers complaining, orders piling up, tips barely covering the effort. And Linda, her no-nonsense manager, had been watching her like a hawk. "You need to smile more," Linda had whispered earlier. "You know how important customer satisfaction is." "Right. Smile more." As if that would fix everything. Megan grabbed a fresh coffee pot and hurried toward the businessman's table, her mind already spiraling through her growing to-do list. And then he walked in. The man strolled through the entrance, slow and unhurried, like he had all the time in the world. He was older, probably in his 80s, but there was something about him, the way he carried himself, the quiet confidence in his posture. He wore a well-worn leather jacket, faded denim jeans, and a Stetson hat that he removed as he took a seat at a corner booth. His boots looked like they had seen decades of dirt roads. Megan barely gave him a second glance. Another elderly guest, probably here for a quiet coffee and a cheap breakfast. She had seen plenty like him, older men who spent an hour nursing a single cup of coffee, leaving behind pocket change as a tip. She let out a quiet sigh, then glanced at her section. Table 14. "Of course, he's mine." Megan grabbed her notepad, tucked her pen behind her ear, and walked over, her usual practiced smile barely holding. "What can I get you today?" she asked, her voice teetering on the edge of impatience. The man looked up, meeting her gaze. His eyes, sharp, piercing, strikingly familiar, studied her for a moment. "Just a coffee." "Black," he said, his voice low and gravelly, carrying a weight that commanded respect. Megan tapped her pen against her notepad. "That's all?" The man's lips curved slightly, almost amused. "And a burger," he added. Megan nodded curtly. "Got it." She turned on her heels, already writing him off as another forgettable customer. As she reached the kitchen, she muttered under her breath. "Really? Ma'am? What is this, the Wild West?" But as she pushed through the swinging doors, she couldn't shake the feeling that something about him stood out. She just couldn't figure out why. And she had no idea how much she was about to regret not paying attention. The afternoon sun had begun its slow descent over the California coast, casting a warm golden glow through the tall windows of Seabreeze Bistro. Inside, the once bustling restaurant had settled into a gentle hum of conversation, the frantic energy of the morning rush fading into a more manageable pace. But Megan barely noticed. Her ponytail had loosened slightly, strands of hair falling around her flushed face. She rolled her shoulders, trying to shake off the ache that had settled deep into her muscles after hours of running between tables. She'd been snapped at, ignored, overworked, and undertipped, and she was running on nothing but caffeine and frustration. And yet, table 14 still lingered. The old man in the worn leather jacket had been sitting there for far longer than most customers. While other guests had come and gone, their chairs scraping against the tile floor as they left, he remained, slowly sipping his coffee, eating his meal at an unhurried pace. As if he had nowhere to be. Megan had served hundreds of guests since starting this job, but there was something unsettling about him, not in a threatening way, but in the way he watched everything so closely. Not staring. Not judging. Just noticing. Like he was taking mental notes of every detail around him, the way the servers moved, the way the food was plated, the way the atmosphere shifted as different customers came and went. She had no idea why it bothered her so much. Maybe because, for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was the one being evaluated and she wasn't sure she liked what he was seeing. With a quiet sigh, she grabbed the check, smoothed out her apron, and headed toward his table. Megan placed the bill down a little too quickly, the paper sliding an inch across the smooth wooden surface. "There's your check," she said, her voice carrying the faintest edge of impatience. "Whenever you're ready." The man didn't reach for it. Instead, he looked up at her, his sharp, observant eyes locking onto hers. For a brief second, she felt the urge to look away. But she didn't. "Do you enjoy your job?" he asked. The question caught her off guard. She blinked, hesitating. Of all the things he could have said, of all the polite phrases people usually exchanged in these brief interactions, that was what he chose to ask? She recovered quickly, giving a half-hearted shrug. "It's a job," she said simply, trying to sound indifferent. "Pays the bills." The man nodded slowly, as if weighing her words. "A job's what you make of it," he said after a pause. "But it seems like you're carrying a lot today." Megan felt her stomach tighten. There was no judgment in his tone. No criticism. Just an observation. And for some reason, that made it worse. She folded her arms across her chest, her posture shifting into defense mode. "Look, I've had a rough shift, okay," she said, her voice a little sharper than she intended. "Not everyone gets to sit around eating burgers and handing out life advice." To her surprise, the man didn't react with annoyance. If anything, he seemed amused. He leaned back in his chair slightly, studying her in a way that made her feel strangely exposed, like he could see through every layer of irritation she was using as a shield. "Fair enough," he said. "But sometimes, the way you treat people in those moments says more about you than you think." Megan felt a flicker of irritation rise in her chest. What was that supposed to mean? Who was he to comment on her attitude? She opened her mouth to snap back at him. But before she could, he stood up, pulling a worn leather wallet from his back pocket. He placed a few crisp bills on the table, tipping his hat slightly as he did. "I'll leave you with that thought," he said, his voice calm, steady. Then, he turned and started toward the exit. Megan exhaled sharply, barely restraining an eye roll. "Yeah, whatever, cowboy." She reached for the check, flipping it over to see what kind of tip he'd left. And that's when she heard her name. "Megan." Her manager's voice rang across the restaurant. Megan looked up, startled, just in time to see Linda hurrying out from the back office, her expression shifting from surprise to pure excitement. Her gaze wasn't on Megan. It was on the man. And then everything changed. Linda reached him just before he exited, her entire demeanor shifting into something Megan had never seen before, respectful, eager. "Mr. Eastwood." Linda beamed, extending a hand toward him. "I wasn't expecting you today." Megan froze. Her heart stopped. The words hit her like a freight train. "Mr. Eastwood?" A creeping sense of dread settled in her chest as she stared at the man's strong, weathered face. And suddenly, everything clicked. The calm authority. The gravelly voice. The sharp, piercing gaze. She had seen him before. Not here. Not in this restaurant. But on screen. Clint. Freaking Eastwood. Megan felt her legs go weak. Her notepad nearly slipped from her fingers. She had insulted Clint Eastwood. The Clint Eastwood. But that wasn't the worst part. Because Clint Eastwood wasn't just a Hollywood legend. He was also the owner of Bashore Hotel. Megan's breath hitched as she watched Linda shake his hand, her manager grinning ear to ear like she had just met royalty. And as Clint turned back briefly, his gaze flicking to Megan one last time, there was a knowing look in his eyes. One that said, "Now you know." And then, he was gone. Megan stood there, frozen, her mind racing, her stomach twisting into knots. Had she just insulted the owner of the hotel she worked for? Had she just made the biggest mistake of her career? Linda turned toward her, beaming. "Megan," she said, practically glowing. "Can you believe it? Clint Eastwood stopped by today." Megan tried to swallow, but her throat was dry as sandpaper. "Why, yeah," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Linda laughed, shaking her head. "He's so hands-on with this place, you know? Every little detail, he's personally involved. That's why we're always reminding the staff to bring their best." Megan felt the air being sucked out of the room. She replayed every interaction she had with him in the past 30 minutes. The eye rolls. The sarcasm. The muttered insults. Her cheeks burned with humiliation. She had just brushed off, mocked, and disrespected her own boss. Her legs wobbled. She needed to sit down. And she had no idea that Clint Eastwood wasn't done with her yet. Megan's heart pounded in her chest. The world around her seemed to slow down, the sounds of the restaurant fading into a dull hum. Linda was still gushing about Clint Eastwood's surprise visit, oblivious to the sheer terror creeping up Megan's spine. She forced herself to nod, to fake some semblance of composure, but inside, she was spiraling. She had just insulted the owner of the hotel. And not just any owner, Clint freaking Eastwood. She needed to get out of here. I think I need a minute," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Before Linda could respond, Megan turned on her heels and practically bolted toward the back of the restaurant, pushing through the door into the small, dimly lit break room. The second the door swung shut behind her, she collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands. What had she done? For 2 years, she had worked at Bashore Hotel, and in all that time, she had never once bothered to learn anything about its owner. She had ignored the stories, tuned out whenever someone mentioned his name, never once thinking it would matter. But now? Now it mattered more than anything. She had rolled her eyes at him. Snapped at him. Mocked him. Her stomach twisted with humiliation. Would he tell Linda? Would she get fired? She couldn't afford to lose this job. Not with rent due in 2 weeks, not with her student loans piling up. Her fingers gripped the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Maybe he wouldn't say anything. Maybe he would just let it go. But deep down, Megan knew better. People like Clint Eastwood noticed everything. And people like Megan? They didn't get second chances. For the rest of her shift, Megan was on edge. She moved through the restaurant with forced smiles, overcompensating for every interaction. She refilled drinks before customers even had to ask. She apologized too much for the wait time, for the weather, for things she had absolutely no control over. She was trying too hard, and it was obvious. Linda noticed. Even Sarah noticed. But Megan wasn't taking any chances. Because if Clint Eastwood had left a message for Linda, if he had told her about the way Megan treated him, it would be over. She kept stealing glances toward the entrance, half expecting someone to walk in and tell her to pack her things. But the hours dragged on, and nothing happened. No phone calls. No managers pulling her aside. No security escorting her out. By the time her shift finally ended, her nerves were shredded. She clocked out, grabbed her bag, and walked out of the restaurant, the cool evening air hitting her like a wave of relief. Maybe, just maybe, she was in the clear. But she had no idea that Clint wasn't done with her yet. Megan barely slept that night. She had tossed and turned for hours, replaying every second of her interaction with Clint Eastwood. By the time her alarm blared in the morning, she felt like a zombie. Dragging herself out of bed, she forced down a cup of coffee and pulled on her uniform, bracing herself for what she was sure would be a terrible day. She had no clue how terrible it was about to get. The lunch rush was already in full swing by the time she arrived. She tied her apron, grabbed her notepad, and forced herself to act normal, smiling at customers, taking orders, pretending like everything was fine. And then, that voice. That gravelly, unmistakable voice. "Well, looks like you're busy today." Megan's blood ran cold. She turned slowly, her heart slamming against her ribs. And there he was. Clint Eastwood. Standing near the counter, his hands resting casually in his pockets, looking at her with that same unreadable expression. Her mouth went dry. She tried to speak, tried to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. He wasn't supposed to be back. Not this soon. Not after what had happened. Why was he here? She swallowed hard, forcing a nervous smile. Mr. Eastwood. Hi. I didn't know you'd be back so soon." He tilted his head slightly, his expression giving away nothing. "I like to check in on my places from time to time," he said, his voice calm, measured. Then, with a glance around the restaurant, he added, "Keeps everyone on their toes." Megan felt herself go pale. Oh God. He knows. She opened her mouth to apologize, to say something, anything, but before she could, he lifted a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "No need to apologize," he said simply. Megan blinked. What? He wasn't angry? He wasn't here to fire her? She stared at him, utterly lost, her brain scrambling for an explanation. And then he said, "I'm not here to make your life harder." Megan exhaled sharply, not realizing until that moment that she had been holding her breath. "But," Clint continued, his voice softer now, "I do think there's a lesson here." Megan swallowed hard. She wasn't sure she wanted to hear it. But she couldn't exactly refuse, could she? "You never know who you're talking to," he said simply. "Or what they might be going through." He let the words settle, watching her reaction. Megan felt her throat tighten. There was no anger in his tone. No condescension. Just honest advice. She had spent so long thinking that customers were just numbers on a receipt, people she had to endure to get through the day. But she had never stopped to think about how she came across. Or how she made people feel. Clint gave her a small, knowing smile. "A little kindness goes a long way." Megan nodded stiffly, suddenly feeling very small. I understand," she said quietly. Clint tipped his hat. "Good," he said. "Just remember, every interaction is an opportunity." And then, just like that, he was gone. Megan stood frozen, the weight of his words pressing down on her. For the first time in a long time, she felt something she hadn't expected. The desire to be better. And she had a feeling that from now on everything would change. Megan stood there, staring at the door Clint Eastwood had just walked out of, her stomach twisted into an impossible knot. The world around her kept moving, customers chatting, silverware clinking, the faint hum of soft jazz from the speakers overhead, but inside, she felt like everything had stopped. Clint hadn't yelled. He hadn't demanded she be fired. He hadn't humiliated her in front of Linda. Instead, he had looked at her with that calm, knowing gaze and left her with nothing but a few quiet words. "A little kindness goes a long way." Megan's breath shook as she exhaled, her fingers gripping the notepad in her hands as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. She had spent all morning dreading the moment Clint would come back and ruin her life. But he hadn't come to get revenge. He had come to teach her a lesson. And that, somehow, felt worse. She had always thought that if she ever lost this job, it would be because of something out of her control, a mistake in an order, a bad tip, a manager in a bad mood. But now, she realized something much more painful. If she had been fired today, it wouldn't have been because of bad luck. It would have been because of her. Megan made it through the rest of her shift, but it didn't feel real. She moved through the motions, taking orders, refilling drinks, clearing plates, but her mind was stuck replaying every single moment of her encounter with Clint. The way she had rolled her eyes at him. The way she had assumed he wasn't worth her time. The way he had looked at her, not with anger, but with something far worse. Disappointment. She could handle a customer yelling at her. She could handle rude businessmen snapping their fingers at her. But the way Clint Eastwood had simply observed her, letting her dig her own grave, letting her reveal exactly the kind of person she had become without him even needing to say a word, was something she couldn't shake. And she hated it. Because deep down, she knew he was right. She had let this job turn her into someone bitter, someone careless, someone who had stopped trying a long time ago. And it wasn't because the job was bad. It was because she had stopped caring. For so long, she had told herself that it didn't matter. That no one noticed. That she was just another waitress in another hotel restaurant, serving another round of tourists who would forget about her the second they walked out the door. But today, for the first time, she realized something she had never let herself believe before. People notice. Even the little things. Maybe especially the little things. And whether she liked it or not, the way she treated people mattered. The next morning, Megan woke up feeling something unfamiliar. Not dread. Not exhaustion. Something different. Something she hadn't felt in a long, long time. Determination. She didn't want to walk into work today as the same person she had been yesterday. She didn't want to be the kind of waitress who rushed through her shift, rolling her eyes and muttering under her breath. She didn't want to be that person anymore. So she made a decision. She was going to try. Not in a fake, forced way. Not in the way she used to, when she thought being a good waitress just meant pretending to smile. No. She was going to try in a way that actually meant something. It started small. When a frazzled mother with 3 kids accidentally knocked over her son's juice, instead of sighing and rolling her eyes, Megan grabbed a rag and smiled. "Don't worry," she said, her voice softer than usual. "Happens to the best of us." The woman looked genuinely relieved, as if she had expected Megan to snap at her. And for the first time in a long time, Megan felt something warm in her chest. When an elderly couple struggled to hear the specials, she didn't rush through them like she normally would. She leaned in, spoke clearly, even added a personal recommendation. The old man smiled at her, his eyes crinkling with warmth. "You've got a good way with people," he said kindly. And Megan almost laughed, because if he had seen her 2 days ago, he wouldn't have said that. But now? Now, she was starting to believe it herself. A few days passed. And then something strange happened. People started noticing. Linda noticed. Sarah noticed. Even the customers noticed. "Megan," Sarah said one afternoon, watching her curiously as she actually smiled at a guest. "You good?" Megan shrugged. "Just trying something different." Sarah gave her a long look, tilting her head. "Well, whatever it is, keep doing it," she smirked. "You might actually get good at this." And then, one evening, Linda called her into the office. Megan felt her stomach tighten, a small part of her still expecting the worst. But instead of a lecture, Linda was smiling. "I just wanted to say," she began, "I've noticed a change in you lately." Megan blinked. She hadn't expected that. "Oh," she said awkwardly. Good change or bad change?" Linda chuckled, shaking her head. "Good," she said. "One of the guests left a comment card about you. Said you gave them the best service they'd had in a long time." Megan felt her breath catch. Someone had noticed. And not only that, they had cared enough to say something. For so long, she had told herself it didn't matter. That no one paid attention. But they did. And maybe it always had mattered. She just hadn't let herself see it. It was a quiet afternoon when Megan heard the door swing open. She turned, glancing toward the entrance. And her breath hitched. Clint Eastwood. Standing there just as casually as before, hands in his pockets, that same unreadable expression on his face. But this time? Megan didn't panic. She didn't freeze. She just smiled. "Table 14, she asked, tilting her head. Clint gave her a small, knowing smile. "Table 14. She grabbed a menu, but he shook his head. "Just coffee." She nodded, heading to the counter, her heart oddly calm. A few minutes later, she placed the steaming cup in front of him. And this time, she didn't just drop it and walk away. She hesitated for a second, then, on impulse, slid into the booth across from him. Clint raised an eyebrow, amused. "Taking a break?" Megan took a deep breath. "I just wanted to say, thank you," she said quietly. Clint didn't say anything right away. But after a moment, he nodded. "You're welcome." And for the first time, Megan realized. This wasn't just a job anymore. It was a chance to be someone better. And she wasn't going to waste it. Megan sat across from Clint Eastwood, her fingers lightly brushing against the smooth surface of the table, her heart steady for the first time since this whole ordeal began. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of him. She wasn't ashamed. She wasn't scrambling to defend herself. She just sat there. Letting the moment settle. Letting herself acknowledge what had happened. She had spent so long pretending this job didn't matter, convincing herself that she was just another faceless server in a sea of unimportant interactions. But that had never been true. And Clint had known it before she did. Clint took a slow sip of his coffee, his sharp gaze still on her, studying her like he was measuring the weight of her words before responding. Megan hesitated, then finally spoke first. "I didn't get it at first," she admitted, her voice quieter than usual. "But I do now." Clint's lips curled into that barely there smile, the kind that held more meaning than words ever could. "I figured you would," he said simply. Megan let out a breath, shaking her head at herself, at how blind she had been, and how much had changed in just a few days. "You planned this, didn't you?" she accused, a small smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. Clint chuckled, setting his coffee cup down with a soft clink. "Not planned," he corrected, his voice carrying that familiar, gravelly weight. "Just hoped." Megan exhaled a quiet laugh, running a hand through her ponytail. She had fought this job for so long, resisted the idea that it meant anything more than a paycheck and a headache. But now, she knew better. And she had a Hollywood legend sitting in front of her to thank for it. Megan's gaze drifted toward the window, watching the sunlight dance across the ocean waves in the distance. She thought about all the customers she had served over the past 2 years. How many of them had she brushed off, dismissed, ignored? How many had she judged too quickly? How many had needed just a little kindness, but never got it from her? She swallowed the lump in her throat, then turned back to Clint. "Do you ever think about that?" she asked suddenly. Clint lifted an eyebrow. "Think about what?" She gestured vaguely. "How many people you've met? How many interactions you've had? How many times you've, I don't know, changed someone's day without even realizing it?" Clint leaned back in his seat, considering her words. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, finally, he said, "Every moment is an opportunity. The question is, what do you do with it?" Megan's throat tightened. Because that was it, wasn't it? That was the whole point. She had spent so much time letting her bad days dictate how she treated people, believing that her job was just something she had to survive. But now, she understood. It was never about the job. It was about the choices she made in the smallest moments. The choice to be bitter or patient. The choice to snap or to listen. The choice to walk away unchanged or to learn. And suddenly, she wasn't just some waitress at a hotel restaurant. She was someone who could make a difference. Even in the smallest ways. Even with a simple smile. And she wasn't going to forget that again. Megan glanced down at her watch and sighed. Guess I should probably get back to work before Linda kills me, she joked. Clint smirked, taking another sip of his coffee. Go on, then, he said. Make the most of it. She slid out of the booth, feeling lighter than she had in years. And for the first time, when she picked up her notepad and turned toward the next customer, she wasn't just going through the motions. She was choosing to be better. Because every interaction was an opportunity. And she was finally ready to take it. It had been a few months since that day. Megan still worked at Seabreeze Bistro, still served coffee and burgers, still dealt with the occasional difficult customer. But something had changed. She had changed. She was more patient. More aware. More willing to see people for who they were, not just as customers, but as human beings with their own struggles. And in return, people noticed her too. Tips got better. Regular customers started asking for her section. Linda even hinted at a promotion. And Megan? For the first time in her life, she felt proud of the person she was becoming. Then, one quiet afternoon, as she was wiping down a table, the door to the restaurant swung open. She didn't even have to look up to know who it was. She smiled. Table 14 was waiting. If this story resonated with you, remember every interaction, no matter how small, is an opportunity to make someone's day better. Be kind. Be present. And never underestimate the power of the smallest moments. If this story inspired you, hit the like button, share it with someone who could use a little encouragement, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life lessons and inspiring stories.